CNBC just released a video titled "How the US Avoided a Recession for a Decade," and it's a horrifying textbook example of an appeal to authority. Argument from authority, also known as appeal to authority, is when someone's authority is used as evidence of their claims on its own. It's a deeply unscientific conduct. Now, I'm gonna use the authority of Carl Sagan to prove my point. One of the great commandments of science is mistrust arguments from authority. Authorities must prove their contentions like everybody else. Arguments from authority carry little weight. Authorities have made mistakes in the past. They will do so again in the future. Perhaps a better way to say it is that in science, there are no authorities. At most, there are experts. You see, CNBC will try to show you how the US has went through its longest economic expansion in history. And they won't do it by proposing or explaining an academically scrutinized economic theory. They will do this by letting corporate officials and politicians make their talking points. First, we have a soundbite from Donald Trump.
We have launched an economic boom, the likes of which we have never seen before.
Then, to give you an illusion of neutrality, you get some from Bernie Sanders too.
Today in America, you got 3 people owning more wealth than the bottom half of America.
I say illusion because the segment then proceeds to shamelessly prove Trump's point that his tax cuts and economic stimulus boost the economy, but I'll get to that. Now look at this. Look who CNBC decided to talk to get economic expertise in this segment. We have Thorsten Slok, a chief economist at Deutsche Bank. Yeah, Deutsche Bank was one of the mainstream investment banks that was behind the 2008 crisis alongside JP Morgan Chase, Lehman Brothers, or Goldman Sachs. It's one of those banks that received trillions of dollars, that's with T, as economic stimulus. But what's this stimulus all about? I'll get to that. Then CNBC invited Mark Zandi, a chief economist from Moody's Analytics. Wow, so many chiefs. Moody's is a Wall Street ratings agency. Much like Standard & Poor's, Moody's was complicit in the scheme that brought down the global financial system. They were giving Wall Street banks AAA ratings on their mortgage bonds that were filled with toxic mortgages. Now, to reflect with Carl Sagan's that authorities have been wrong in the past and they will be wrong in the future, Moody's was wrong by about $864 million. Oops. And to close the loop, CNBC went to see David Wilcox, former Director of Research and Statistics at the Federal Reserve. Is it time to talk about the stimulus problem now? Yes, it is time. To be honest, CNBC does bring up this stimulus because it was so huge you cannot not talk about it.
The Fed was able to come in, purchase about $4 trillion worth of securities, drive up their price, and therefore bring down the interest rate at which businesses were able to borrow, households were able to take out a mortgage.
Let me deliver a different explanation of what really happened. Because we abandoned the gold standard, the US dollar is backed by the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. Before the 2008 recession, the Fed's balance sheet was filled with rock-solid treasury bonds that never go under. These bonds are backed by the government and they are always repaid. When the financial crisis hit, the Fed purchased $4 trillion of toxic bonds and private mortgage-backed securities from the investment banks and replaced their bank accounts with solid treasury bonds. So now, the US dollar is backed by these fraudulent private bonds. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is called the economic stimulus. Was this necessary?
Absolutely fucking not.
These bailouts went to financial corporations that were irresponsible and engaging in risky investments. This is how the Fed propped up bad business practices. Now their argument is that this stimulus boosted the GDP growth and stock market prices. It also boosted CEO pays and earnings of the top 1%. But someone has to carry the burden of irresponsible businesses, and it's the 99% of the population, because their wages didn't go up. Their standards of living didn't improve, because the housing prices are skyrocketing again, but home ownership rates are still lower than they were 20 years ago. 3 minutes into the video, CNBC will try to make an argument that the Fed should take the credit for economic expansions lasting longer than before.
The period from the mid-1980s to 2007 became known as the Great Moderation. Prices remained stable, and while there were occasional dips, on the whole, the economy chugged along.
Black Monday of 1987, which was the largest one-day drop in stock prices in history, with worldwide losses at $1.7 trillion. Or the dot-com bubble, that caused massive layoffs of programmers and IT departments, an immense consolidation of the technology market that gave Google and Amazon their dominant positions, which we can never escape from. You know, just occasional dips.
One reason for this is that officials at the Federal Reserve got more effective at responding to changes in the economy. And because inflation was steady, policymakers could act aggressively when the next crisis came along.
Oh, thank goodness for the Fed. They saved us. Oh, yes, the merciful Fed saved us. Jesus Christ, how many sweaty dicks did CNBC have to suck to brew this bullshit up? Giving the Fed credit for long-lasting expansions makes me beg the question, who then takes the blame for all the recessions? It's so ironic because looking at it historically, the Fed failed miserably at boosting expansions and stabilizing recessions. The Fed was created in 1913 with the sole purpose of preventing people from running on their bankers and withdrawing their cash from banks they feared were insolvent. That's where the Fed succeeded. People were no longer able to use their market power to let irresponsible bankers go bankrupt. Instead, the Federal Reserve would prop them up by printing new money. The extra credit on the market led to a stock market boom in the 1920s. Everybody was happy. But somehow, the Fed couldn't predict, prevent, or moderate the total economic collapse that followed immediately after that. And somehow, the Fed couldn't do anything about the dot-com bubble burst or the 2008 financial crisis. Ironically, the segment even features Ben Bernanke, the former Fed chairman, admitting they couldn't predict the 2008 recession.
None of us anticipated the full ramifications and extent of the crisis.
When you lay out these facts, it makes you think, what is the Fed's job really? Because it clearly isn't to make the economy more healthier. And then at that moment, it hits you. The Fed exists to protect the banks. That's why they didn't hesitate for a second to bail out insolvent banks after 2008. And that's why the Fed didn't even flinch when it gave them $3 trillion in the last 3 months. When any of these chief economists say they are doing this to support the economy,
fiscal policy and monetary policy, meaning the Federal Reserve and politicians, were much more quick out of the box in terms of supporting the economy.
By economy, they don't mean you. They don't mean the middle class, the working people, small or medium-sized businesses. No, fuck that. They only mean investment banks and stock market. That's where all those trillions of dollars in stimuli goes to. Somehow, when it comes to the big banks and big corporations, there is always trillions of dollars for them. But when it comes to universal basic income or social programs, God forbid, you can't do that. How are you gonna pay for that? This question is only asked when it comes to supporting regular people. It is never asked when it's about corporate welfare. A study found that Bernie's Medicare for All would increase the government spending by $32.6 trillion over 10 years. If we take this at face value, that's about $3.3 trillion a year. That does sound like much, but did you know that that is exactly how much the Fed gave the big banks again in the last 3 months? I made a video on this recently. YouTube is trying really hard to suppress it, in spite of having the highest engagement of any of my videos in my channel. And no mainstream media has paid any attention to this. But it is true. The New York branch of the Fed has been crediting big banks with billions of dollars on daily basis over a period of 3 months. This money was created out of nothing. It wasn't even printed. It was literally just credited to the big banks. And why, you may ask? Well, because the banks had such insufficient liquidity, they couldn't even pay their own taxes. That's literally what started the stimulus package. And it's infuriating that nobody is talking about this, as if it was business as usual. Remember when I mentioned that CNBC will give you an illusion of neutrality? I said this because this segment only uses a very specific set of metrics to prove the economy is growing. Is the GDP growth, stock market prices, and unemployment. And while the video does briefly mention increasing income inequality and decreasing home ownership rates,
by one estimate, the wealthiest 10% of Americans own more than 80% of the stock market's wealth.
As the stock market rises, that disbenefits that, the top 20% and really the top 10% and really the top 1% and really the top 1/10 of 1%. So the wealth distribution has gotten much more skewed. The other thing that's happened is home ownership rates have declined, right? So home ownership was key to the wealth of middle income Americans. That obviously got creamed in the financial crisis and the housing bust. And so home ownership rate today is meaningfully lower than it was when it peaked 10, 15 years ago.
CNBC pays way more attention trying to sell you this idea that the economic stimulus package was what brought the economy out of the recession, and now everything is good. In 2008, the US economy hit its lowest point since the 1930s, but CNBC won't tell you how low this point really was. What I will tell you is that
the deeper the hole, the longer it takes to climb out.
So when the segment says,
from the end of 2009 to the end of 2019, the US economy has added more than 20 million jobs.
It classifies this as part of the expansion. But when we look at a context, we'll quickly see that its 20 million job creation is no sign of expansion at all, because the economy hasn't even climbed out of its hole. Instead, this is a painfully slow recovery, and expansion will only start once we get out of this hole. We can see this visualized on a graph provided by the Federal Reserve of St. Louis. The chart we are looking at is an employment population ratio. It measures how many people are in employment relative to the entire population of the United States, dating way back to World War II up until last November. We can see recession times marked in gray areas. In every recession, we see a significant dip in employment rates, but very soon after each recession, the employment rates went back up to their peak point from the last expansion. But the job growth from the 2008 recession hasn't reached full recovery. The US economy hasn't reached its expansion levels since before the recession kicked in. In reality, they are not even halfway through. So it's not a decade of expansion. It's a decade of painfully slow recovery. We are entering dark ages of the information age, with this whole YouTube push to present authoritative channels like CNBC. Being authoritative doesn't make them right, it makes them predictable. YouTube knows that corporate news media will never say something that would rile people up. They will never go against their own interest or against the interest of established corporations. They will only report on the status quo and present it to you through the lens that brings them more advertisers and won't challenge their bottom line.